Here you can see I've cleared out the console by clicking this clear thing here. That won't actually forget any of the code that you've put. If you do want to actually forget the variables, you can click the refresh button up here, and that will actually forget everything. Now I'm getting the error that came back just with the Google page, but I can clear that here. So I can actually create variables fresh that way. So use this refresh button if you really want to clear out what your code remembers. So now if I were to type cheese, it'll tell me that it doesn't have cheese as defined anymore because I refreshed the page. But let's do this. I'm going to make a variable var not num. I'm going to assign it a value of 5, but I'm putting it in quotes because it's not really a number. It's a string with a number in it. And I could make another variable, var new num. I'm going to assign it a value of 10. So that's it. That's actually a number. Now watch this. If I do new num plus not num, it gives me a 105 inside quotes. Now, JavaScript is loosely typed. You do not have to specify what type of data a variable is going to hold when you create the variable. And a lot of people don't like that about JavaScript. And way back in the day, when they were working on ECMAScript 4, you'll remember that version was never released. They were thinking seriously about switching JavaScript to being a more strongly typed language, like other languages, where you have to declare what type of data a particular variable will hold when you create the variable. But in JavaScript, you don't have to do that. And Douglas Crockford, who we mentioned earlier, made a strong argument that the loosely typed nature of JavaScript is actually very expressive and very powerful in its own way if you know how to use it properly. But it can lead to confusion. And here's a good example of that, where we might get something that we don't expect. Perhaps we expected to add 10 to 5 and get 15, but instead we got 105 in a string. So that's kind of an important distinction and something important to understand about the way JavaScript works. Another thing to note is that the plus operator in JavaScript does double duty. It will add numbers together, so we could make another variable, var new num2, and assign it a value of 6. And then I could do new num plus new num2, and it'll give me 16. So it'll add numbers together, but it will also concatenate strings. So here we were seeing the plus sign actually doing some concatenating because one of those elements was a string. So it concatenated it together, and I got 105. And down here, when we use the plus sign, it's actually adding. This is a problem in JavaScript, and they've done some things in the language to help mitigate the fact that the plus sign does both things. But and we'll look at what we can do to deal with that. We'll look at some better ways of putting strings together other than using the plus sign. But these features of JavaScript that were built in from the beginning persist to this day. And the plus sign still does two things. It concatenates and it adds. So here we're seeing already very much at the beginning of the course things about JavaScript that are a little bit different. We're seeing that it is a loosely typed language, and that's unusual. We're also seeing that the plus sign does double duty, and that's not only unusual, but a little bit problematic. And so already you're learning a little bit about why we use JavaScript in certain ways or why we type it in certain ways. And we'll get into more detail about that as we go along.